I've always loved the Game Boy. It's just something that just clicked with me even from a young age, and sadly I never had one when I was younger, but as an adult I've sort of made up for that. And I want to talk today about how well the refurbished parts, the new parts that you can get for your various Game Boy models, actually hold up after heavy use. I'm mostly going to be talking about the Game Boy Pocket today because that's my daily driver. So I use various Funny Playing and RetroSix parts to refurbish this Game Boy Pocket a year and a half ago, and I want to tell you how well I think it stood up, really. I pretty much already said that, didn't I? Anyway, without further ado, let me tell you all about it. So this Game Boy Pocket was the donor board that's inside of this came from a Game Boy Pocket that I purchased 3.5 years ago when I first came here to Japan. I won a Yahoo auction with a nice yellow Game Boy Pocket, perfectly working, no problems with the screen, 5 or 6 games including the fantastic Mole Mania and a Game Boy camera. Can't go wrong for 1600 yen. Anyway, unfortunately, my memory was a bit hazy and I just couldn't get on with that original non-backlit screen like on this currently unmodified Game Boy Pocket in my hands here. So after a couple of years or so, I decided it's time for a new backlit LCD, a new case, new buttons, and generally making it as good as new again. So how has it held up? Well, I'm pleased to report extremely well. This Game Boy Pocket just goes with me everywhere. Virtually every day this goes somewhere with me, and I've found that as a daily driver I've been very happy with it. So in terms of the quality of the case, I've been very happy with it. This is a RetroSix case. I found that no creaks or cracks have developed. Sure, there are a few scratches where keys may have scratched it when it's been in my pocket, and rather funnily enough, my skateboard grip tape rubbed against the back of the Game Boy Pocket here when I was walking along. In fact, I was just been skating in the skate park in Spain. I'd gone over there for my brother's wedding last summer, in summer of 2022 that is, and I noticed when I got back to the hotel that perhaps where I'd been carrying the skateboard that the grip tape had rubbed against the Game Boy and had chamfered off the edge of the Game Boy and also the Tetris cartridge that I had in the unit at the time. But overall, it's held up really well. Even the white colour, whilst it has some minor discoloration where my hands are probably not the cleanest, unfortunately, on occasion, have slightly dulled the colour on the edges here. Overall, I've not noticed any major discoloration. Likewise, in terms of the actual texture of the plastic, yes, it has worn down in places, but overall, yes, nothing more than you would ordinarily expect. So I feel that the case has held up really well, and I won't be replacing it anytime soon. In terms of the buttons, these have also held up very well. Yes, they have become a little bit less textured, especially the D-pad. That has become a little bit more worn down over time. But overall, the durability of the buttons has been great. And on the whole, until recently, I'd say the responsiveness has been wonderful. I do feel that the membranes may be just past their peak of their best, because I'm beginning to find that occasionally one of the buttons might stick if I'm frenetically playing something like Mega Man. I'm like, ah, and I just noticed that the button will stick momentarily. Likewise, I've even noticed it a little bit with the D-pad. But most of the time, the responsiveness of those membranes has been fantastic. And let's face it, replacing the membrane is particularly cheap, so I'm very happy with how that's held up. In terms of the screen lens, that's like the glass or the plastic lens that goes over the actual LCD itself, fantastic. This is a glass screen lens from Funny Playing. I have noticed that it picks up fingerprints really well, but in terms of the actual durability and does it pick up scratches and that kind of thing, not a scratch to be seen. And this has been bouncing around in my rucksack, it's been in my pocket, it's been all over the world with me. Well, if you can include going to the UK, to Spain, and living in Japan as the world. But, it's been halfway around the world with me on various trips. So yeah, I feel that the actual screen lens has been fantastic. And yes, occasionally I give it a little bit of a clean on the screen when my fingerprints get a bit too distracting or too gross. But overall, fantastic little screen lens. Oh, and very quickly before I forget it, the on-off switch, yeah, absolutely fine. It's lost some of its initial clickiness. Here's another Game Boy Pocket. Here's one I made earlier. This one, again, modified in the same way but with a different colour case. The on-off switch has a lot more clickiness, so clearly that action has worn down a little bit since I modded my daily driver Game Boy Pocket. But overall, it's not been found switching on by itself very often. Occasionally, I've had to fish it out the bottom of my rucksack and notice that the batteries are dead, and that's because it has flicked itself on. So, onto the screen itself. This is a Funny Playing backlit IPS screen, and wow, this thing has made the Game Boy a sheer joy to play over the last year and a half. For my aging eyes, I've found this fantastic. I love the fact that I can change the colour with the touch control at the top. That particular part of it has worked perfectly. I haven't experienced any problems with it. I do occasionally find that the colour mysteriously changes when the unit's been switched off and I go to switch it back on again. But largely I just use it with a black and white effect. No retro pixel grid effect because I find it dims the screen too much. I just find a simple black and white option just looks wonderful, and I've found that playing on the Game Boy with this screen has been wonderful. There have been no bad pixels that have developed, and more importantly, the actual fixing and adhesion of the screen to make sure that it's nice and square and level and doesn't end up slipping and becoming wonky has held up extremely well. So really, this is a fantastic modification to your Game Boy Pocket, one that I can't recommend highly enough. So overall, I have been extremely pleased with how well these replacement parts have held up over the last year and a half of really heavy use. I've completed many games on this, many hours of puzzle games. You know, I've played through Mega Man 1, 2, 3, and most of the way through 4 now on this. Just got 5 to go, and I've played through things like Kirby Star Stackers, Kirby no Kizu as it is in Japan, and Yoshi's Cookie to its full extent, as well as many others. So this unit has seen hundreds of hours of gameplay. The last aspect I want to mention is these replacement stickers. I didn't put the serial number back onto the unit because that was a bit scuffed up on my original, and I couldn't really be bothered, to be honest with you. But this replacement sticker is beginning to peel at the edges. You know, both corners there are beginning to show signs that it could be just peeled off. I'm just going to leave it like it for now, because I think if I remove that, eventually the text underneath will just wear away and it will become even more unsightly. But it's very easily replaced. So I'd say that's the most obvious sign of where this unit has been used carefully. But otherwise, I can highly recommend those particular components. So, how come I've got so many Game Boys here? How come? Well, one of the things that I noticed is that I have a couple of games that make use of a quirk of the original Game Boy. That's the brick DMG Game Boy screen. And because it had a slow refresh rate leading to lag and so forth, some game developers took advantage of that to create sort of like a quasi-transparency effect. Games such as Skate or Die, Bad and Rad, which I've got in here at the moment. On stage 3, Konami basically used that effect where they flashed the colour on and off very rapidly to effect like a water transparency in an underground sewer stage. So unfortunately, on backlit screens, that flashes like crazy. Can you see how the so-called water is flashing there? Yeah, not so good, is it? Now, one of the things that I found is that even though the Game Boy Pocket, its original screen, has a better refresh rate than the original brick DMG does, it does mean that stages like that still look a bit more playable than they do on backlit screens. So keeping around an unmodified Game Boy Pocket is quite a good idea if you want to play some of those rare instances where that faux or quasi-transparency effect was used. So that's why I think keeping around an original Game Boy or an original Game Boy Pocket with its original screen is a good idea, because it does mean that playing those certain stages or those games that use that quasi-transparency effect, it doesn't look quite so unsightly or hard on the eyes on the original screens. Talking of which, this Game Boy Pocket here was a recent pickup. This cost me 2,100 yen in Surugaya in Nagoya. It was in the junk bin, and I was pretty certain I knew what was wrong with this. It didn't say on it, but I was pretty certain that they probably tested it and found it didn't power up. And I thought, I bet the battery terminals just need a little clean. And that's exactly what it is. I cleaned them up, actually, whilst I was sat down in Nagoya, sheltering from the blazing heat of a summer's day, and cleaned the battery terminals, and it worked first time. So Game Boy Pockets can still be had relatively affordably here in Japan. Even this one, which had a perfectly good LCD screen with no screen burning, with the polarizer that's gone bad. If you're looking for a suitable donor unit, you can sometimes pick up a Game Boy Pocket that has a supposedly bad screen. You can see this when they have like a big black stain on the screen. You can think, wow, that LCD must have gone bad. But actually what it is the polarizers. There are two. There's one on the front and one on the back of the screen. Now usually you can get away with just replacing the front polarizer, but sometimes you need to replace both. And whilst it's a bit tricky, it's not actually that difficult of a job if you take it very, very carefully. Now this is an original Game Boy Pocket DMG style, all original Nintendo case, buttons, the lot. It was in fantastic condition, but that screen had a polarizer problem. Now you can see on this one, I've just done an old school backlight mod on it. I replaced both the polarizers and it's now functioning beautifully. The only problem I've got is that the front polarizer has got some air bubbles underneath it, which I can easily fix. But this wonderful, wonderful condition Game Boy Pocket, with only minor modifications, cost me a grand total of 1,200 yen on Yahoo auctions, purely because I kept an eye out for something that was going to go cheap, and that black polarizer effect really put people off, thinking like, well, maybe it's never going to work. So, a bit of a bargain, I think you'll agree. And last in this segment is this Game Boy Pocket. This one contains a extremely cheap broken Game Boy Pocket that I picked up for about 900 yen. Had both problems with powering up and also with the polarizers having gone bad. But after cleaning up the main board thoroughly, because it had quite a lot of leaked battery acid on it, and replacing the screen with new shell, new buttons, stuff works. This is now my backup unit should this one ever let me down. So this is in wonderful condition, and this feels just like how this one did when I'd first modified it. So I know that this stuff is durable, but yeah, it does look beautiful, I think, in this DMG look, but I must admit, my favourite still remains this rather fetching white case. So I want to wrap this video up now. What do I think you should modify? If you're in the market for a Game Boy, which one should you go for? Should you go for the original DMG? Should you go for the Game Boy Pocket, which succeeded it in 1996? Or should you go for maybe the Game Boy Color? Because this obviously gives you the option of playing both enhanced Game Boy games in colour, but also colour exclusives like this wonderful Europoni, I believe, port of one of my favourite games of all time, Rainbow Islands, which is absolutely wonderful on this. I mean, some of the bosses are a little bit easy, but otherwise, Rainbow Islands on the go, absolutely, get in there. So, yes, the Game Boy Color is an option, and I think you'll agree that my colourway for this one is pretty fetching. So we'll leave that powered up. And of course, we have the wonderful Game Boy Advance. In this case, it's the original shape and size that came out in 2001, but the Game Boy Advance SP is another option. So which one of these would I suggest you buy to modify? Well, I thought about this long and hard, and as much as I'm just going to turn that down, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, that's a wonderful game, but we don't need to hear it. As much as I absolutely love having the Game Boy Pocket, and I play this mostly, I think if you're only ever going to have one Game Boy, yeah, you could go for the Game Boy Color, and you can't tell me that that doesn't look hella nice. Basically, I think there's only one unit for it, and that would be the Game Boy Advance. I think the original layout is the nicest. I know that the folding design is nice and compact of the Game Boy Advance SP, but I think the form factor of this, plus the fact that it offers you native compatibility with original Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, as well as Game Boy Advance, obviously, I think makes this a winner. And I think that if you're going to spend all the money on modifying a Game Boy today, you might as well put the money into the one that's going to give you the access to the most games. Now, Game Boy Advance games can be a bit more expensive than the original Game Boy games, particularly the more sought-after titles like Zelda and the Minish Cap, for example, and some Game Boy Color games, such as the port of Metal Gear Solid or Metal Gear that appeared on that, can be expensive. But a lot of Game Boy games can be very affordable. So, and that's why it's a system I still really love to pick up games for and enjoy. So I would go with modifying a Game Boy Advance if I was going to spend that money these days. You can come to Japan and find suitable donor units, but yeah, you're going to have to keep your eyes peeled because the junk ones in stores like Super Potato, Suragaya, Hard Off and so forth are few and far between sometimes, but they are out there. If you're over in Japan, maybe you should spend some time on Yahoo Auctions hunting down a Game Boy which has got maybe some polarizer burn or some other fault where it says it's not powering up. I can almost guarantee you, when it comes to original Game Boys, the battery terminals just need a darn good clean, and when it comes to the Game Boy Advance, the switch here often just oxidizes and just needs a bit of a cleanup. If I can fix these things, you definitely can. And I have like next to no soldering skills, and I managed to do all of this. It took me a little bit of time, but I think after a year and a half of enjoying my Game Boy Pocket, as well as the Advance and the Color, I can highly recommend that when you buy new parts for these systems, they are going to last a duration. Anyway, that's enough from me. I've nattered enough. I really want to play some Star Sweep. It's a fantastic puzzle game. You should go and check it out. Anyway, if you have modified your Game Boys, let me know what you did down below. I'd love to hear it. And if you've got any questions for me, just drop them down there. I'd love to hear from you. Anyway, that's all from me. See you soon. Peace.